Hi everyone, my name is Dr. K, and in this presentation we will talk about how to describe your population and sample in Chapter 3. Population and sample are foundational sections of your study because they define exactly who your study is about and who actually provided the data you will analyze. And here's what we will cover in this session. First, we will learn how to distinguish between a population and a sample. Then we will discuss how to define and apply inclusion criteria for your study. After that, we will look at sampling methods and how to justify your sample size. And finally, we will end with common mistakes to avoid and some practical tips for success. Your population is the full group of people who meet your study's criteria. In every study, the population must be defined very clearly and usually by answering three questions: who, where, and when. In this section, it is very important to explain your inclusion criteria and provide a rationale for them. Also, your population must align directly with the purpose of your study and your research questions. On this slide, you can see several examples of well-defined population. Please pause the video to read each, and we will look at the first two examples together. You might say the population for this study included all first-year STEM students at Sunshine College during the fall 2024 semester. Another example could be, the population consisted of full-time teachers working in Mississippi middle schools during the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see that in both cases, each statement specifies who was included, the setting for the population, and the time frame for them being in that setting, which keeps the definition precise and easy to understand. Your sample is a smaller group drawn from the population, and these are the actual participants in your study. When describing your sample, make sure to explain the method you use to select participants. You will also need to provide a rationale for your sample size, supported with references from the literature. In short, your sample should be described in enough detail that readers can see exactly how it connects back to the larger population. Building on the same examples we used for the population, here's how we can describe a sample. Again, please pause the video to read all, and we will go over the first two together. From the population of first-year STEM students, you might say that the sample included 150 students who completed the online survey. From the population of Mississippi teachers, the sample could be the 115 teachers who responded. Each description shows how the sample was taken from the larger population and makes it clear who ended up participating in your study. Inclusion criteria are the rules that determine who can and cannot be included in your study. These criteria define the characteristics that participants must have in order to qualify. They should be based on your research purpose and questions, and they help the reader understand why certain individuals were eligible while others were excluded. In this section, be sure to explain how you applied or verified these criteria. And remember, this should be written in narrative form, not as a bulleted list. Continuing with our previous examples, here are some clear inclusion criteria. For a study on first-year STEM students, the inclusion criteria specify that participants had to be enrolled as first-year students at Sunshine College during fall 2024 and majoring in STEM. For survey with teachers, the inclusion criteria required that they were employed full-time, were a teacher in a Mississippi middle school, and were employed during the pandemic. As you can see, each example connects directly to the research purpose and ensures participants were chosen intentionally. Now that we explained our sample, let's focus on how to clearly justify our selection. When it comes to sampling methods, the explanation you need to provide depends on your research design. In quantitative studies, you will explain whether you use probability or non-probability sampling, such as random, stratified, or convenience, and why that method fits your research questions. In qualitative studies, you will describe participant selection strategies like purposeful, snowball, or criterion-based sampling. In either case, the key is to explain how your method supports your research questions and ensures you can gather the type of data you need. Another thing we need to justify is our sample size. We cannot just report our sample size or our number of participants. We need to explain how we decided on that number and why that number is adequate for our study design and research questions. In quantitative research, you can use a power analysis, effect size, or prior studies to show how your sample size is appropriate. In qualitative research, sample size is usually tied to the design, such as case study, narrative, or phenomenological research, and supported with methodological sources. The most important point is to explain why your chosen sample size makes sense for your study and use citations to back it up. To conclude, let's go over a few common mistakes to avoid and practical tips for success. There are a few common mistakes to avoid when writing this section. One is using the terms population and sample interchangeably. Remember that these are two different elements and both should be explained. Another is forgetting to specify who, where, and when as you describe your population. Your population will only be clear to the reader if you answered all three questions. Next, don't forget to account for all inclusion criteria you set for your study, as well as to explain why they matter. And finally, always ensure that your sample size is not only reported, but also justified based on your research design and intended data analysis. To be successful, make sure you clearly define your population, inclusion criteria, and sampling method, and back them up with references. Remember to always show how your sample aligns with your research questions. And as a final tip, practice using the appropriate terminology. Quantitative studies usually use terms like sample or sample size, while qualitative studies use terms like participants or participant selection. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope it gives you clarity on how to write the population and sample section in Chapter 3.